The neighborhood was designed to look flawless. Every detail had been measured, planned, and enforced with a precision that left little room for individuality. Lawns were trimmed to exact heights.
I will not tolerate
Driveways
this
were free of
blatant
variation.
disregard for the
Even
community
the colors
standards.
of homes followed a limited
You are in
palette that
direct
ensured
violation
visual
of the
consistency
community
across every
guidelines.
street.
Clean this
From the
up
outside,
or face
it
the
appeared
fines.
perfect. But perfection in this neighborhood did not come naturally. It was maintained. Carefully. Constantly. And at the center of that maintenance was the HOA. The association did not merely provide guidelines, it defined expectations. What could be changed, what had to remain the same, what required approval, and what was not permitted at all. Everything operated within a structured system designed to eliminate unpredictability. Most residents adapted. It was easier that way. Because resisting the system required time, energy, and attention that few were willing to invest. Compliance was simpler. Quiet. Efficient. But within that structure, there were individuals who did not just follow the rules. They enforced them. One of those individuals stood above the rest. The HOA president. His presence in the neighborhood was consistent and unmistakable. He was not loud, not aggressive in the traditional sense, but precise. Observant. Methodical. His approach to enforcement was not emotional, it was systematic. Every detail mattered. And every deviation was noted. Over time, his role expanded beyond administration. He became the central point through which all decisions passed. Approvals, rejections, inspections, everything aligned with his interpretation of the rules. And his interpretation rarely allowed for flexibility. The narrator had observed this pattern from a distance. Like many others, he had chosen not to engage. The neighborhood functioned best when interactions remained minimal. Following the guidelines avoided unnecessary attention. And avoiding attention was, in many ways, the most effective strategy. For a long time, that approach worked. Until a new house entered the system. It stood out immediately. Not because it violated any obvious rule, but because it carried a subtle difference. Its design, while technically compliant, did not fully align with the neighborhood's aesthetic rhythm. It felt independent. Not disruptive. But distinct. The property had been vacant for some time before its new ownership. During that period, it had existed quietly, attracting little attention. But once activity began, maintenance, minor updates, signs of occupancy, it naturally drew observation. The HOA president noticed. At first, his attention followed routine patterns. A standard review of the property. Documentation checks. Confirmation that everything aligned with community standards. But something about the house did not sit comfortably within his framework. It wasn't a clear violation. It was something less defined. And that made it more difficult to categorize. The narrator became aware of this shift through subtle indicators. Increased inspections in that area. Additional documentation requests. A heightened level of attention directed toward the property compared to others nearby. It was not obvious. But it was consistent. The house, despite its compliance, had become a point of focus. And focus, within this system, often led to escalation. The owner of the property, however, remained largely unseen. No public interactions. No visible responses. No engagement with the HOA beyond what was strictly necessary. This absence created a gap. A space where assumption could form. And assumption, when combined with authority, can lead to action. The HOA president began to interpret the lack of engagement as resistance. Not active resistance. But passive. A refusal to fully participate in the system. And within a structure built on control, even passive resistance can be perceived as a challenge. The inspections became more frequent. Requests for clarification expanded. Minor details were reviewed with increasing intensity. The property itself did not change. But the scrutiny around it did. The narrator observed this carefully. Because patterns like this rarely remain contained. They develop. They build. And eventually, they reach a point where action replaces observation. That point came sooner than expected. It began with a notice. A formal document outlining concerns regarding the property, details that required immediate attention, adjustments that needed to be made, compliance that had to be verified. The language was precise, structured, and firm. But it carried an underlying tone. Authority. The expectation was clear. The owner was required to respond. But the response did not come. Days passed. Then more. The silence continued. The HOA president interpreted that silence as confirmation. Not of compliance. But of defiance. And within his framework, defiance required correction. The next step moved beyond documentation. It moved into action. He initiated a property inspection, one that, under normal circumstances, would require coordination with the homeowner. But this situation was no longer, in his view, normal. The lack of response had shifted his approach. He justified the action through procedural interpretation, maintenance concerns, community standards, the need to verify compliance directly. Each reason aligned with policy, at least on the surface. But the execution crossed a boundary, because verification does not always grant access. And access, without permission, changes everything. The day of the inspection arrived quietly. No announcement. No coordination. Just a decision. The narrator became aware of the movement indirectly. The presence of the HOA president near the property, the timing unusual, the behavior more deliberate than routine observation. There was intent. And that intent carried weight. The house itself remained still. No visible activity. No sign of occupancy from the outside. It appeared, in that moment, empty. And that appearance reinforced the decision. The HOA president approached the property with the confidence of authority. His actions were measured, controlled, and justified within his own understanding of the system. He was not breaking the rules. He believed he was enforcing them. That belief guided everything that followed. The entry itself was not forced in the traditional sense. It was facilitated through opportunity, a point of access that, while not secured, was not open for use without permission. But permission, in his framework, had become secondary. Compliance had taken priority. He stepped inside. And in that moment, the structure of control shifted completely. Because what he entered was not an empty house. And what he had assumed to be a routine enforcement action was about to become something far more serious. The narrator, observing from a distance, understood the significance immediately. This was no longer about HOA rules. This was no longer about compliance. This was about a boundary that had been crossed. A boundary that did not belong to the HOA. A boundary defined by something far more structured, far more absolute, and far less flexible. The system that had once operated within controlled limits had just extended beyond its reach. And when that happens, the outcome is no longer predictable. Because not all systems allow interpretation. Some require adherence. And the house he had entered belonged to someone who understood that difference better than anyone. The moment the boundary was crossed, the nature of the situation changed in a way the HOA president had not anticipated. Until that point, every action he had taken existed within a system he understood. Rules, enforcement, documentation, these were familiar tools, governed by a structure that allowed interpretation and control. Within that structure, authority could expand gradually, shaped by precedent and reinforced through repetition. But the interior of the house did not belong to that system. It operated under a different one entirely. The president stepped into a space that reflected order, but not the kind he was used to imposing. Everything inside was deliberate, organized, precise. There was no sign of neglect, no evidence of the violations he had anticipated. The environment did not suggest resistance. It suggested discipline. That contrast introduced the first layer of uncertainty. Because the assumptions that had justified his actions no longer aligned with what he observed. Still, he continued. Not out of confidence, but out of momentum. The inspection, as he understood it, required verification, documentation, confirmation that the property met community standards. His reasoning remained intact, even as the environment challenged it. But underlying that reasoning was something deeper. A pattern that had shaped his approach long before this moment. The HOA system, as it functioned in the neighborhood, had gradually shifted over time. What began as a framework for maintaining consistency had evolved into something more complex. Enforcement was no longer purely reactive, it had become proactive, preventive, expansive. This shift did not happen all at once. It developed through small adjustments. A stricter interpretation here. An additional requirement there. Each change, individually, seemed reasonable. But together, they created a system where authority extended further than originally intended. The president had adapted to that evolution. And in doing so, he had internalized it. His role was no longer limited to enforcing clear violations. It had expanded to identifying potential ones. To anticipating deviations before they occurred. To maintaining a level of control that ensured the neighborhood remained consistent with its defined standards. That approach required vigilance. And vigilance, when sustained over time, can transform perception. What was once optional becomes necessary. What was once a guideline becomes a rule. And what was once a boundary becomes flexible. This was the underlying struggle. Not visible on the surface, but present in every decision. The president believed he was protecting the integrity of the neighborhood. But in doing so, he had begun to extend his authority beyond its intended limits. The House represented that extension. It was not non-compliant. It was independent. And independence, within a system built on uniformity, creates friction. That friction had driven the increased scrutiny, the repeated inspections, the expanding requirements. Each step had been justified within the system's logic. But the logic itself had shifted. And now, standing inside the house, that shift was being tested. The narrator, observing from a distance, recognized this pattern clearly. It was not unique to this situation. It had appeared before, in smaller forms, affecting different properties in subtle ways. But never at this scale. Because this time, the system had moved beyond observation. It had acted. And that action carried consequences. Inside the house, the president began to notice details that did not fit his expectations. Documents arranged with precision. Materials that suggested a high level of professional engagement. An environment that reflected not just compliance, but authority of a different kind. Not HOA authority. Something else. Something structured. The realization did not come all at once. It formed gradually, piece by piece. Each observation adding to a growing awareness that this property was not ordinary. And that the person who owned it was not operating within the same framework as the rest of the neighborhood. This introduced a second layer of struggle. Uncertainty. Because uncertainty disrupts control. The president's actions, which had once been guided by confidence, now required reassessment. The assumptions that had justified entry no longer held the same weight. The system he relied on did not provide clear guidance for this situation. And without clear guidance, authority becomes unstable. At the same time, the external environment continued to evolve. The narrator was not the only one who had noticed the unusual activity. Movement around the property had drawn attention. Subtle at first, but growing. Neighbors, accustomed to routine patterns, recognized when something did not align. The presence of the HOA president inside a home, without visible coordination, was not typical. It stood out. And standing out, in this context, created awareness. Awareness leads to observation. Observation leads to interpretation. And interpretation, when shared across a community, begins to shape perception. The underlying structure that had once allowed the HOA to operate quietly was beginning to shift. Not through confrontation, but through visibility. The president, still inside the house, was unaware of how quickly that shift was taking place. His focus remained internal, directed toward understanding the environment he had entered. But the situation was no longer contained within those walls. It was expanding. Because the boundary he had crossed was not just physical. It was structural. The HOA system had limits. Legal limits. And those limits existed regardless of interpretation. The president had operated for so long within a framework that allowed flexibility that the existence of those limits had become less immediate in his thinking. But they had not disappeared. They had simply not been tested. Until now. The narrator understood this clearly. Because systems reveal themselves most clearly when they are pushed beyond their intended scope. And this situation had done exactly that. The struggle was no longer internal to the HOA. It had become external. Between two systems. One built on community standards and interpretation. The other built on law and defined authority. These systems could coexist, when boundaries were respected. But when those boundaries were crossed, coexistence becomes conflict. The president had not intended to create that conflict. But intention does not determine outcome. Action does. And the action had already been taken. Inside the house, the final layer of realization began to form. Subtle at first. Then unmistakable. The documents, the environment, the structure of the space, all pointed toward a level of authority that extended far beyond the neighborhood. The house did not just belong to a resident. It belonged to someone who operated within a system where boundaries were not flexible. Where authority was clearly defined. And where violations carried consequences. The underlying struggle reached its peak in that moment. Because the president was no longer in control of the situation. The system he had relied on could not resolve what he had initiated. And the system he had entered would. The narrator, still observing, understood that the situation had moved beyond recovery through explanation. It had entered a phase where resolution would be determined not by interpretation, but by law. And law does not adjust itself to accommodate overreach. It responds to it. The house, once just another property within the neighborhood, had revealed itself to be something more. A boundary. A line that should not have been crossed. And now that it had been, the consequences were already in motion. The moment inside the house did not explode into chaos. It settled into something quieter. A tension that did not announce itself, but grew steadily as awareness replaced assumption. The HOA president, who had entered with certainty, now moved through the space with a different kind of attention. His actions slowed, becoming more deliberate, less automatic. What had begun as a routine enforcement step was no longer guided by the same clarity. Each detail he observed no longer confirmed his expectations, it challenged them. And with that challenge came hesitation. The house did not reflect neglect. It reflected intention. Everything was arranged with precision. Not in a decorative sense, but in a functional one. Documents were organized, surfaces maintained, and the overall environment carried a quiet sense of control, not imposed from the outside, but established from within. This contrast began to reshape the emotional landscape of the situation. For the first time, the president was not acting within a system that supported him. He was moving within a space that operated independently of his authority. And that independence carried weight. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to absorb the shift as well. At first, the awareness spread subtly. A glance from one house to another. A moment of observation that lasted slightly longer than usual. Residents who had become accustomed to predictable patterns recognized that something was different. The presence of the HOA president inside a private home, without visible coordination, was not part of those patterns. It did not fit. And when something does not fit within a structured environment, it draws attention. The narrator observed this carefully. Not just the actions, but the reactions. The way people paused in their routines. The way movement slowed near the property. The way attention, once scattered, began to focus on a single point. The house had become more than a location. It had become a center of awareness. And awareness, once shared, begins to form connections. The neighborhood, which had long operated through quiet separation, was now experiencing a subtle form of unity. Not through communication, but through observation. Each resident, independently, was processing the same event. And in doing so, they were aligning, emotionally, if not verbally. This alignment created an emotional bridge. A connection formed not by agreement, but by shared experience. For years, the HOA's influence had shaped behavior through isolation. Each resident managed their own compliance, avoided attention, and minimized interaction with the system wherever possible. The structure worked because it kept individuals separate. But now, that separation was weakening. Because the system itself was being observed. And when a system becomes visible, it loses some of its power. Inside the house, the president was experiencing his own version of that shift. The certainty that had guided his actions was no longer stable. The environment around him did not validate his assumptions. Instead, it introduced a new perspective, one that required him to reconsider not just what he was doing, but why he was doing it. This internal shift was not immediate. It developed gradually, each observation adding to a growing awareness that the situation had moved beyond his control. The documents he noticed, carefully organized, professionally structured, suggested a level of engagement that extended beyond ordinary property ownership. They did not belong to someone who ignored systems. They belonged to someone who understood them deeply. That realization did not bring clarity. It brought weight. Because understanding a system changes how one interacts with it. And the president was beginning to understand that the system he had entered was not one he could interpret freely. Outside, the emotional bridge within the neighborhood continued to strengthen. The narrator saw it in the way attention lingered. In the way people remained present, even without direct involvement. There was no confrontation, no open discussion, but there was awareness. And awareness carries emotion. Each one narrowing the gap between action and consequence. The narrator observed how the balance shifted with each step. The presence that had once enforced rules was now being asked to justify its own actions. The system that had operated with confidence was now being evaluated with neutrality. And neutrality, in this context, carried weight. Because it removed influence. It removed assumption. It left only fact. The house itself, which had served as the setting for the initial action, now became evidence of something larger. Not just a property, but a point where boundaries had been tested and crossed. The public nature of the moment reinforced its significance. Residents were no longer interpreting events through indirect observation. They were witnessing the outcome directly. The HOA, which had once been perceived as an unquestioned authority, was now part of a process it did not control. This shift altered perception in a way that could not be reversed easily. Because once authority is seen within limits, it is understood differently. The president's realization deepened as the process unfolded. The internal uncertainty he had experienced inside the house now aligned with the external structure around him. The difference between systems was no longer abstract. It was immediate. The justification that had once seemed sufficient no longer held the same weight. The framework he had relied on did not extend into this space. And without that extension, his actions existed without the support he had expected. The tension reached its peak not through escalation, but through clarity. Everything was now visible. The action, the context, the boundary, and the consequence forming around it. The narrator recognized that this was the turning point. Not because something dramatic had occurred, but because something undeniable had been revealed. The HOA system had limits. And those limits had been crossed. The public challenge was not about opposition. It was about exposure. The exposure of how far a system had extended. And where it could no longer go. The neighborhood absorbed this understanding collectively. The quiet acceptance that had once defined their relationship with the HOA was replaced with something more balanced. Awareness. And awareness changes how systems function. Because it introduces accountability. The president, standing within this moment, was no longer operating from a position of control. He was part of a process that would determine the outcome based on factors beyond his influence. The shift was complete. The situation had moved from internal enforcement to external evaluation. From assumption to fact. From control to consequence. And there was no returning to the previous state. Because once a boundary is crossed publicly, it cannot be redefined privately. The next phase would not be shaped by interpretation. It would be defined by resolution. And that resolution would come from a system that did not bend. Only applied. The shift from tension to clarity did not arrive with a single moment. It unfolded through recognition. As the situation moved fully into the control of an external system, the structure that had once supported the HOA president's authority no longer applied. What had been justified internally was now being evaluated externally, and that evaluation followed a different standard, one that required clear boundaries, lawful access, and defined permission. The house itself became central to that realization. Not because of its design or condition, but because of its ownership. The details that had seemed subtle inside the property now carried meaning. The organization, the documentation, the precision of the environment, all pointed toward someone who operated within a highly structured framework. And then the connection became clear. The homeowner was not simply private. The homeowner was part of the federal judiciary. That fact did not create the violation, but it illuminated it. The president had not just crossed a general boundary. He had entered a space protected by a system that understood boundaries at the highest level. The difference was not in severity, but in clarity. There was no ambiguity about access, authority, or limitation. The revelation spread quickly, not through conversation, but through understanding. The individuals assessing the situation no longer needed to interpret context, they recognized it. And with that recognition came alignment. The action that had been taken could no longer be framed as procedural enforcement. It was identified as an authorized entry. The system that had been triggered now operated with full awareness of what had occurred and who it involved. The HOA's internal structure disappeared from relevance in that moment. Because the situation no longer belonged to it. The president, who had once interpreted rules with confidence, now faced a reality where interpretation held no weight. The boundary he had crossed was not flexible. It did not adjust based on intention or assumption. It existed. And it had been violated. This was the unexpected revelation, not just of who owned the house, but of how different systems define authority. The HOA functioned through influence and interpretation. The law functioned through definition and enforcement. And when the two intersected, only one determined the outcome. The resolution did not come with spectacle. It came with process. The situation, once driven by assumption, was now guided entirely by structure. The actions that had taken place were reviewed within a framework that required clarity, not interpretation. The result was not shaped by emotion or perception, it was determined by established boundaries and the consequences tied to them. The HOA president was no longer acting within his role. He was subject to evaluation. The same principle that had governed his authority within the neighborhood, compliance, now applied to him in a different form. But this time, the standard was not defined by community guidelines. It was defined by law. The outcome followed naturally from that shift. The unauthorized entry, once viewed internally as enforcement, was recognized externally as a violation. And that recognition carried consequences that could not be adjusted or minimized. The neighborhood absorbed this quietly. There was no need for reaction. The event itself had already changed perception. The authority that had once seemed absolute was now understood as limited. The system that had operated with confidence was now seen within the boundaries it could not cross. The house returned to stillness. But it no longer represented isolation. It represented clarity. The narrator reflected on the sequence of events not as conflict, but as alignment. A system had extended beyond its limits, and in doing so, had encountered a boundary that required correction. That correction did not require force. It required visibility. Once the action became visible, it could be measured. Once it was measured, it could be resolved. And once resolved, it reshaped everything around it. The HOA remained. Its structure continued. But its influence changed. It was no longer defined by assumption. It was balanced by awareness. The lesson was not about authority failing. It was about authority being defined. Because control, when left unchecked, expands until it meets a boundary. And when that boundary is clear, it does not negotiate. It restores balance. The president's actions had not just created consequence. They had revealed a truth. That systems built on interpretation must always exist within systems built on law. And when the two intersect, only one determines the final outcome.